Hi everyone. Welcome to English Story School, where we bring language learning to life through captivating stories that not only improve your English, but also inspire your imagination. Have you ever stopped to think about the true power of perspective? Imagine this. What if the way you view obstacles, setbacks, and even your achievements could be the key to unlocking a version of yourself that you never thought possible? What if, by simply changing how you look at the world, you could radically transform your life? Today, we're going to explore how your perspective shapes your growth and how adjusting the lens through which you see the world can lead to incredible, life-changing results. Let's step into the world of a young dreamer named Ben, whose story unfolds a powerful lesson about overcoming adversity and realizing one's potential. Ben was a passionate young man, brimming with big dreams of becoming an artist. He could often be found lost in his thoughts, sketching or imagining beautiful creations in his mind. Art was his heartbeat. Every line he drew, every stroke of color he envisioned, felt like a part of him coming alive. But, as with many dreams, reality had a way of presenting itself, harshly and often uninvited. Ben wasn't born into wealth or privilege. His family, though loving and supportive, didn't have much in terms of resources. There was no gallery space, no high-end materials like expensive paints or canvases, and certainly no art tutors to guide him. What Ben had instead were modest tools, pencil stubs, scraps of paper, and his unwavering determination. He had dreams bigger than the walls of his small room, but he felt confined by the reality of his circumstances. He found himself staring at a blank canvas of life, unsure of how to fill it. Where others seemed to have everything, resources, opportunities, and connections, Ben felt like he was starting at a disadvantage. He watched from the sidelines as people with more advantages seemed to effortlessly rise to success, taking art classes, attending exclusive events, and getting the best of what the art world had to offer. Meanwhile, Ben, with his humble beginnings, felt like an outsider in the very world he longed to be a part of. For a long time, Ben carried a heavy burden of self-doubt. The thoughts in his mind echoed relentlessly. I don't have what they have. I didn't grow up with the opportunities they had. How could I possibly compete with them? My dream is too big for someone like me. These thoughts were a constant weight on his shoulders. Every time he tried to draw or create, he couldn't help but think about all the things he didn't have. The money for art classes, the expensive brushes, the studio space, the connections that could help him make it big. He felt as though the world of art was reserved for those born into better circumstances, and he was just a small dot in a sea of talented, well-resourced artists. It's easy to see why Ben's perspective was clouded. In a world where success often seems tied to privilege, resources, and opportunity, Ben's story mirrored the feelings of many who believe they don't have enough to reach their dreams. We've all been there at some point in our lives, wondering if we could ever truly succeed without the same resources as those who seem to have everything handed to them. But it was in the midst of these struggles and doubts that something remarkable began to happen. Something that would change Ben's life forever. Ben's journey was one of realization, an epiphany that would break him free from the shackles of his limitations. One day, while sitting in his small room, feeling the weight of all his frustrations, Ben began to look at the world around him differently. As he absent-mindedly sketched, a thought crossed his mind, a question that would alter the course of his life. What if the things I see as obstacles are actually stepping stones? What if the lack of resources, the absence of formal training, the smallness of his space, what if all of that could be turned into something extraordinary? Instead of seeing his lack of expensive art supplies as a barrier, he started to see them as an invitation to be more resourceful, to stretch his imagination in ways others couldn't. The scrap paper, the pencil stubs, the leftover ink from old pens. Ben began using these materials to create unique works of art. His pieces took on a raw, unconventional quality, unlike anything the art world had seen before. In his willingness to embrace what he had, Ben began to develop a style all his own. His art wasn't just creative, it was a reflection of his journey, his perseverance, and his ability to make something beautiful out of very little. Slowly but surely, Ben's work began to gain attention. People were drawn to the originality and authenticity of his pieces. They could see the soul in his art, the imperfections, the rawness, the honesty. The very things that Ben once saw as his limitations were now the elements that made his work stand out. Ben's story is a profound reminder that growth and success don't come from having everything. Sometimes they come from making the most of what you already have. It's about finding opportunity in adversity, strength in struggle, and growth in what others might dismiss as limitations. Ben's transformation came not from acquiring more resources, but from changing how he viewed his circumstances. By shifting his perspective, he discovered that what he had was more than enough to start the journey toward his dreams. This shift in mindset didn't just affect Ben's art. It transformed his entire life. When Ben let go of the belief that he was at a disadvantage, and instead embraced the idea that his current situation had the potential to fuel his growth, everything changed. It wasn't about comparing himself to others anymore. It was about trusting his own process, believing in his ability to make something meaningful from what he had. Ben's story is a powerful testament to the idea that perspective is everything. In the end, Ben's journey teaches us a crucial lesson. Success doesn't come from what we have or don't have, but from how we see the world around us. When we change our perspective, when we stop focusing on what we lack and start appreciating what we have, amazing things can happen. Ben's art, born from the most humble beginnings, eventually became his legacy, not because he had more, but because he saw his limitations as the foundation of his success. And that, my friends, is the magic of perspective. So, what's your perspective? What dreams might you have that are waiting for the right shift in mindset to bring them to life? Just like Ben, you have the power to transform your life by changing how you see the world around you. The question is, are you ready to make that change? One quiet afternoon, as the world outside continued its rush and hum, Ben sat alone in his small, humble room, surrounded by the things he'd come to rely on: a few worn-out pencils, an assortment of scraps of paper, and remnants of ideas that were never fully realized. His space was cramped, the walls bare except for a few old sketches pinned haphazardly. A far cry from the sleek, polished studios he'd seen in magazines or the grand art schools he'd dreamed of attending. Yet, there he was in this modest setting, pouring his heart onto the page with the few tools he had. He had always been frustrated by his circumstances. The brushes he wanted, the easels he imagined, and the vast art supplies that others seemed to have in abundance. They all felt like distant dreams. But as he sat there, staring at the simple pencil in his hand, something inside him shifted. He paused, his hand stilling on the page, and for the first time in a long while, Ben allowed himself to truly look at his situation. Not with the eyes of a frustrated artist, but with the eyes of someone open to new possibilities. In that moment of quiet reflection, Ben realized something profound. All this time, he had been viewing his limitations as obstacles, things that held him back, barriers that defined what he could and could not achieve. He had often told himself that if only he had more resources, more access to expensive materials or professional guidance, his art would be better, his path clearer. But now he saw things differently. What if these very limitations weren't the end of his story? What if they were actually the beginning of something more profound? This thought caught him by surprise, like a gust of wind stirring the stillness around him. Ben began to ask himself a question that would change the course of his creative journey. What if these limitations, these obstacles, weren't the roadblocks I believed them to be? What if they were invitations, challenges meant to spark more creativity, to push me to think in ways I hadn't before? As he sat there, looking at the scraps of paper scattered across his desk, he began to see them not as remnants, but as opportunities. What if, instead of feeling confined by what he didn't have, he embraced the idea that the very lack of resources could be the catalyst for a new kind of creativity, one that wasn't dependent on fancy tools or a well-funded studio? Could the limited materials he had at hand push him to create something unique, something that came from a place of ingenuity and resourcefulness? It was a radical shift in perspective. Ben had spent so much of his life thinking that in order to create something meaningful, he needed more. More tools, more knowledge, more time. But what if the opposite were true? What if the scarcity of resources actually forced him to become more inventive, more flexible, more adaptable? What if the limitations were a challenge to think outside the box, to craft something extraordinary out of the ordinary? The more Ben thought about it, the more excited he became. It wasn't about what he didn't have. It was about what he could do with what he had. The faded pencil, the wrinkled paper, the ink stains that had once seemed like imperfections. All of them could now be the building blocks for something new. Every scar on his tools, every flaw in his materials, could be turned into a unique form of expression. He no longer saw the lack of art supplies as a hindrance, but as an invitation to innovate and stretch the boundaries of his creativity. Ben's mind began to race with new ideas. He picked up an old newspaper and started folding it into new shapes. He looked at his coffee cup and wondered what would happen if he used the coffee stains as part of his artwork. The cracked edges of his sketchbook, which he had once considered discarded, suddenly became part of his creative process. He began to experiment, mixing ink with tea, painting with brushes made from old bristles, creating textures from things he never would have imagined before. The constraints of his resources began to liberate him, pushing him to see beauty in the imperfections, to find art in the discarded and overlooked. It wasn't long before Ben's work began to reflect this shift in mindset. His art became raw, unique and unlike anything people had seen before. What he once thought of as limitations became his strengths. His sketches, built on scraps of discarded materials, were now celebrated for their originality. People started to take notice. The very elements that once held him back, his lack of resources and formal training, were now the defining characteristics of his art. And that was the beauty of it. In the moment when Ben realized that his limitations weren't a curse, but a gift, he unlocked a new level of creativity and growth. By changing how he viewed his situation, he found a wellspring of possibility where he had once seen only frustration. The turning point was simple, yet profound. He stopped waiting for the perfect moment, the ideal resources, or the perfect conditions. Instead, he embraced the challenge, and in doing so, he found freedom. It's in this moment of realization that Ben truly began his journey as an artist, not just through the tools he had, but through the mindset he cultivated. By shifting his perspective, Ben discovered that sometimes the key to unlocking one's potential is not in acquiring more, but in making the most of what's already in front of you. And so, Ben made a bold decision, one that would mark the turning point of his journey. Tired of waiting for the perfect circumstances or the ideal resources to materialize, he resolved to embrace what he already had, no matter how limited it seemed. The moment he chose to accept his reality rather than lament his lack of opportunities, something powerful shifted within him. It was as if the world suddenly opened up, offering him a fresh perspective that had always been right in front of him. Instead of continuing to wish for the perfect canvas that artists like him dreamed of, Ben started to see the beauty in the everyday materials around him. He looked at the pile of old newspapers that had been collecting dust in the corner of his room and saw potential. The crumpled, yellowed pages, once destined for the trash, became his canvas. Ben didn't stop there. He turned to what others might dismiss as waste: coffee stains from forgotten cups, ink left behind in discarded pens, and even worn-out pencils that had long lost their sharp edges. At first, his work was rough. The edges of the newspapers curled and tore as he applied ink, and the coffee stains spread unpredictably across his creations. It wasn't polished. It wasn't the sophisticated work of an artist with formal training. It was raw, spontaneous, and unrefined. But there was something about it, something people could sense. There was a rawness and honesty in his art, a vulnerability that no amount of expensive supplies or formal lessons could have replicated. The imperfections became a signature, a mark of authenticity that drew people in. Ben's work, born from the limitations he had once seen as barriers, began to stand out. It had an undeniable energy, an originality that was unlike anything people had seen before. His use of everyday materials, things that were often thrown away or overlooked, became a statement. He wasn't just creating art. He was telling a story of resilience, of making something beautiful out of nothing. Each piece was infused with the essence of his journey, a journey that didn't rely on abundance or perfect conditions, but on creativity, resourcefulness, and the willingness to make the most of what was available. As he continued to create, word of Ben's unique artwork began to spread. People who had once ignored his work, dismissed him as just another dreamer with no means to achieve his goals, began to see what he had always seen in himself: a fire for creativity, a boundless passion, and an ability to turn adversity into opportunity. His art didn't just reflect his talent. It became a reflection of his spirit, his resilience in the face of hardship, and his determination to make the most of the cards he'd been dealt. At first, the recognition came slowly. Ben's work was unconventional, so it didn't fit the traditional mold that people expected. But there was something powerful about it, something that resonated deeply with those who saw it. His art spoke to the very essence of the human experience, of struggling, of failing, and of rising above it all to create something meaningful. It was a reminder that greatness doesn't always come from perfection. Sometimes it comes from embracing imperfection and finding beauty in the unexpected. Ben began to get noticed by more than just friends and family. People from different walks of life, from art collectors to casual observers, started taking a genuine interest in his work. They were drawn not just to the artwork itself, but to the story behind it. The story of a young man who, despite having so little, was able to create something that was uniquely his. Ben's art had become a metaphor for his life, a life that had been shaped by challenges, but also a life that was defined by the choice to not be defeated by them. As the world began to recognize Ben's talent, he found himself in a place he had never imagined. The young man who once thought his dreams were unattainable was now being invited to showcase his art in galleries, to have his creations displayed in spaces that were once out of reach. He had turned his limitations into his greatest asset, and in doing so, he had proven something not just to others, but to himself: that success isn't defined by what you lack, but by what you do with what you have. Ben's story became an inspiration to others who, like him, face their own struggles and limitations. They saw in him a reminder that dreams don't require perfect conditions to be realized. Sometimes it's not about having the best tools or the most resources. It's about having the courage to start, the creativity to innovate, and the resilience to keep going even when things seem impossible. As Ben's art continued to make its mark, he realized that the greatest gift his limitations had given him was not just the ability to create, but the ability to see the world differently. He had learned to see potential where others saw scarcity, to see opportunity where others saw defeat. And in doing so, he had unlocked the true power of creativity, the ability to transform the ordinary into the extraordinary, to turn adversity into triumph, and to shape a future that was no longer defined by what he didn't have, but by the limitless possibilities of what he could do with what was already in his hands. In the end, Ben's journey wasn't just about becoming an artist. It was about embracing a mindset that would serve him throughout his entire life. A mindset that saw challenges not as roadblocks, but as stepping stones. And in doing so, he not only transformed his art, but transformed himself. Ben's shift in perspective was nothing short of life-altering. It wasn't just his art that underwent a transformation. His entire outlook on life, his dreams, and his understanding of success were redefined. Before this pivotal moment, Ben had been trapped in a cycle of frustration. He had spent years lamenting his lack of resources, believing that without the ideal circumstances or the perfect tools, His dream of becoming an artist would forever remain out of reach. But as his mindset shifted, so did his understanding of growth itself. Ben soon realized that the key to success wasn't about accumulating more resources, more connections, or more opportunities. Rather, true growth often emerges not from abundance, but from the ability to make the most out of what you already have. In a world that often tells us to strive for more, Ben's story became a powerful reminder that what we need to succeed is often already within our grasp. It's not about what we lack, but about what we do with what we've been given. As he looked at the worn-out pencils, the scraps of paper, and the old newspapers, he saw more than just the materials at hand. He saw possibility. He learned to see beauty in the struggle, to find a deeper meaning in the obstacles that once seemed like insurmountable barriers. The same constraints that had once made him feel defeated were now the very things that spurred him forward. Ben discovered that limitations, when viewed with the right perspective, are not restrictions. They are invitations to think differently, to innovate, and to grow in ways that abundance might never have allowed. In the past, Ben had assumed that success was reserved for those who had everything they needed. The well-funded artists who had the latest technology, the top-tier training, and the connections to big-name galleries seemed to have the upper hand. But now, with his new mindset, he began to see those limitations as an opportunity rather than an obstacle. Instead of feeling disheartened by what he didn't have, he was energized by what he could create with what was available to him. This shift wasn't just a change in how he viewed his art, it was a transformation in how he saw life itself. He began to understand that growth wasn't always a linear path, nor was it dependent on external circumstances. Growth often comes through the process, through the journey itself. The small steps forward, the tiny victories, and yes, even the setbacks along the way. Ben came to appreciate that every challenge he faced was an opportunity to grow stronger, to become more resourceful, and to stretch the boundaries of his creativity. In every difficulty, there was a hidden lesson, a chance to learn something new and expand his potential. This realization began to shape his entire life, not just his art. Ben no longer viewed setbacks as defeats, but as experiences that were shaping him into the person he needed to become. His once overwhelming obstacles, lack of resources, no formal training, and isolation became stepping stones on his path to growth. Each time he faced a challenge, he didn't just ask himself, "How can I overcome this?" but rather, "What can I learn from this?" This subtle but powerful shift in perspective made all the difference. Instead of fighting against his circumstances, he began to work with them, adapting and finding creative solutions where others might have given up. Ben's new way of thinking also allowed him to see growth in a broader sense. It wasn't just about improving his artistic technique or achieving recognition for his work. Growth was about becoming a better version of himself, more resilient, more adaptable, and more attuned to the opportunities that lay hidden within life's challenges. Ben realized that life itself was an ongoing process of growth, and that each moment, no matter how small, contributed to his evolution. It wasn't about arriving at some final destination. It was about the journey, the continual expansion of his potential. The beauty of Ben's shift was that it didn't require him to change everything about his life or his situation. He didn't need to move to a bigger city, take out loans for art supplies, or find a famous mentor. All he had to do was change his mindset, to embrace the challenges and see them as opportunities rather than obstacles. It wasn't about gaining more, it was about making the most of what he had right in front of him. And in doing so, he found growth not just in his art, but in every aspect of his life. His relationships, his outlook on challenges, and even his personal sense of fulfillment began to shift. As Ben's art evolved, so did his inner world. He began to understand that growth is not always about achieving something tangible, but about the ongoing transformation that occurs inside us as we navigate life. The more Ben embraced his limitations, the more he discovered new strengths and abilities within himself that he never knew existed. Ben's story is a powerful testament to the idea that growth is not something that happens when we have everything we think we need. Growth happens when we make the most of what we have, when we choose to see the world and our circumstances through a lens of possibility rather than limitation. His journey shows us that we don't need to wait for the perfect moment to grow. We just need to start with where we are, with what we have, and trust that growth will follow. And often, that growth comes from the most unlikely places, found in the struggles we once saw as obstacles. In the end, Ben learned that growth is not just about achieving success, but about embracing the process of becoming. It's about learning, adapting, and finding joy in the act of creation itself. It's about seeing every moment, every challenge, and every resource, no matter how limited, as an opportunity to grow and transform. And perhaps most importantly, it's about realizing that true growth doesn't come from having more, but from making the most of what we already have. This brings us to a critical realization. Growth isn't about the resources at your disposal. It's about how you choose to look at the world. The same situation can be seen in so many different ways. It all depends on the lens you choose. Take a moment to think about it. When life hands you a challenge, do you see it as a problem? Or do you see it as an opportunity to learn and improve? Ben didn't see his lack of resources as something that held him back. He saw it as a chance to stretch his creativity beyond conventional boundaries. This shift from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset is essential. When you stop seeing failure as defeat and start seeing it as a lesson, your potential becomes limitless. Consider, for example, the process of learning a new skill. In the beginning, it's easy to get discouraged. You make mistakes. You stumble. It feels like you're getting nowhere. But what if, instead of focusing on the difficulty, you looked at each mistake as an essential part of the journey? What if you saw every misstep as one step closer to mastery? Suddenly, learning becomes not just bearable, but exciting. The challenge isn't a barrier. It's the pathway to growth. And this isn't just a lesson for artists like Ben. It's a universal truth woven into the very fabric of life itself. If you look to nature, the lesson is clear. Think of a tree, for example. A tree doesn't sprout overnight into a towering giant. It begins as a tiny seed buried deep within the soil. It faces obstacles, the pressure of the earth above it, the lack of sunlight, the cold winds, But over time, it continues to grow. Slowly but surely, it pushes upward, breaking through the soil, reaching for the sky. But if the tree had stopped at the first sign of struggle, it would never have grown. Growth, like the tree's journey, requires patience, persistence, and a shift in perspective. It requires us to trust the process, to understand that setbacks are not failures, but milestones in our development. And in our own lives, growth is never a straight line. There will be moments when you feel stuck, when you think you're not progressing, but the key is to adjust your perspective. Every step, every challenge, and every mistake is part of the bigger picture. The true power of perspective becomes even clearer when we take a step back. When you shift your view of growth, you start to realize that it's not just about achieving external success. It's about your internal transformation. It's about becoming more resilient, more adaptable, and more open to change. Growth is about learning to see setbacks not as roadblocks, but as signs of progress. It's about understanding that challenges are opportunities in disguise. When you shift your perspective and begin to embrace every challenge as an opportunity for growth, you become unstoppable. As we wrap up today's journey, remember this: the power to change your life lies in your perspective. The way you view challenges, failures, and successes shapes your ability to grow. By choosing to see every setback as a lesson, by choosing to turn obstacles into stepping stones, and by trusting the process of growth, you'll unlock a world of possibility. Growth doesn't happen overnight, but with the right mindset, every step you take brings you closer to the person you're meant to be. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.